Hello, world. We are live. Welcome to the June 2024 edition of the Laravel Worldwide Meetup. My name is Dan Sapelsa. I'm a co-host along with Margaret Tavares. We are once again very excited to bring you some incredible speakers from the Laravel community, sharing their insights on web application development. How you doing today, Margaret?
I am doing wonderful, Dan. Thanks so much. How are you doing?
Excellent, excellent. The weather continues to improve. We've been in the middle of a heat wave here in Canada, so I've been enjoying this summer weather. Definitely not complaining about the weather, and also very much looking forward to our two hot talks that we have lined up today. And before we get into those talks, we've just got a little bit of housekeeping here, a few slides to share. And take it away, Margaret.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. Let's talk about what's new and happening in the Laravel community. So here we have Laravel News. Here you'll find an amazing podcast and a weekly email newsletter. So make sure to sign up for them at laravelnews.com, where we have Jake Bennett and Michael Drinda discussing all the latest Laravel releases, tutorials, and happenings in the community. Next up, we have the Laravel podcast. So you can check them out at laravelpodcast.com. Right now, what Matt Stauffer has going on is he is working with Taylor Otwell for every episode here in season 6. So make sure to check them out at laravelpodcast.com. Next up, we got Lara Jobs. So if you're looking to hire, looking to post a job, and for all your Laravel job needs, you can check them out at larajobs.com. The official Laravel job board. Next, we have Laravel Live Denmark. So here you can still get your tickets. This is the first Laravel conference held in the Nordic countries, and it's less than 2 months away. So all the way in Copenhagen and Denmark, you can join them August 22nd to the 23rd at laravellive.dk.
Tickets still available.
And Laracon US tickets have been sold out. So this is an exciting trip where you will see us here. So if you're joining us, make sure to say hi. We'll come and do some fun stuff. But that's going to be happening in Dallas, Texas from August 27th to the 28th. And you can see more information at laracon.us. Another addition to some community announcements, we have the GTA, which is the Greater Toronto Area PHP user group. So a dedicated group of developers, and they have hybrid meetup groups. So you can check them out at meetup.com/GTA-PHP user group Toronto. You can make sure to head them up. They're a great community to learn and be a part of. And we want to make sure to thank our host Vehicle for their support in relaunching this entire meetup. So they have a great team of developers, and if you have a Laravel problem, they'd be happy to help you out. And make sure to hit them up at vehicle.com or email them at go@vehicle.com. We also have our giveaway, so make sure to sign up by scanning that QR code. You'll be prompted with a form, and the winner will receive, two winners will receive an email from our community manager, Lee. So watch out for that email. And this is a prize from our sponsor, JetBrains. So thank you so much to one of 2 IDEs that are good for an entire year. All right, and I'll pass it back off to Dan to introduce our wonderful speakers for today's meetup.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. Like we said, we have 2 wonderful speakers lined up once again this month. We're about to bring the first one in here. So we have Katerina joining us. Katerina is going to be sharing some wonderful insights into how we can enhance team performance through developer experience. And then second, last but not least, we have Felipe, a very fellow Viacalian, joining us, and he's going to be talking about a not entirely new, but newish feature within the Laravel framework, the Fluent Assertions specifically, and how you can kind of elevate your Laravel test specifically using the Fluent Assertions. And with that, we have our first speaker ready to come in here, so we don't want to keep her waiting any longer. Our first speaker, if you've attended a Laracon EU event in the past, there's a chance you may have seen her speak before. Katerina has spoken multiple times at the Laracon EU event. And at that event, she shared her insights in software development and team dynamics, largely probably through her experience as the CEO of Adiva, where she finds herself as CEO and co-founder. And Katerina is also the host of the CTO Insights podcast. The most recent episode, I highly recommend. I just started and already very much enjoying it. She had Kent back on to share his thoughts on team dynamics and software practices. So check that out. And we have Katerina here today to share her talk, Enhancing Team Performance by Improving Developer Experience. Hello, Katerina. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing good.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Margaret. How are you too?
Good. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you very much for joining us, Katerina. So without further ado, we don't want to leave things too much longer. Do you have any questions? Do you need anything? If not, we'll have you share your screen and we can kind of get into your talk. And then hopefully at the end, I'm sure we'll have a bunch of good questions and that have come out of your talk, and we'll have a little question period towards the end. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Katerina, we can hand things off to you.
Okay, so
All
I'm
right.
here to talk about enhancing team performance by improving developer experience. Just a bit of background, Dan already shared that. I'm the co-founder of Adiva. That's a talent marketplace where we work with a lot of companies that want to scale their teams flexibly. I'm an engineer at heart, even though I kind of stumbled upon this founder experience. So every time I talk about engineering, I try to combine the two. And whenever I give an engineering talk, kind of give it an angle from business perspective or customer value, or basically the impact that we can have as engineers that is beyond just writing the code. And that's what I want to talk about today. So to start off, the main question is what impacts team performance? And I asked a lot of developers and managers this question. The answers were, most of them were revolving around shifting project requirements, or a lack of big picture, context switching, accurate planning, maintaining quality, all of these things kind of contributing to bad code. And when you think about it from this perspective, measuring lines of code doesn't improve team performance. It cannot improve team performance because it is a metric that a lot of managers rely on to kind of grasp what they can do within their team, what they can improve to increase the velocity or increase the quality and everything. But it's just counting the input, and what we need to focus on is the output, how much value we can create, how many new features we can deliver, what's the ease of developing these new features, and basically the developer experience. So improving that developer experience will definitely increase performance, and it will do it as a side effect, because if it's easier for us to read through our code, if it's easy for us to manage it, to extend it, to add new functionality fast, that means that the value that we create for customers will significantly increase, and the performance of our whole team will significantly increase. So I will talk about this from the perspective of what we're doing at Adiva. And this is a real life example just to kind of grasp the challenge that we have more easily. All of the examples will be related to this. So this is the account settings on our platform. We have Payoneers and wire transfer as payment options right now. And throughout the examples, I will consider designing the code in a way that will make it easy to extend this with additional payment options in the future, because it is a very something that we expect to extend with additional payment options for developers to get paid in different ways. So the first step would be to organize for readability and easy navigation. And what happens here, a lot of this good design is relying on the solid design principles, basically segregating our interfaces, depending on small and easy to read classes and interfaces where we'll definitely know what happens and where do we keep the relevant code. This is what the interface would look like. Basically, payment options interface that will have functions to get the field, store, delete, or make a method primary, and then the two classes that implement this interface. So the wire class implementing the concrete functions, and then the Payoneer class implementing it again. So very straightforward, very common, I would say, in Laravel development, to just start with the contract and then create the classes. And now continuing from here, when we implement these interfaces, we need to decouple our code or ensure the single responsibility if we go in solid terms. So every class should be responsible for a single thing. And when I say this, it's not a lot of times when developers are decoupling code, it's very easy to fragment it too much and make it even more difficult to manage. So a lot of common sense should take a role here. We need to think about what a single responsibility is. We need to think about what we want to decouple and what we are okay with keeping together, because a lot of times there's no such thing as perfect code. A lot of times the speed of delivery makes us do trade-offs, and we need to be aware of these trade-offs and how to structure everything so we can deliver much faster in the future. So that should be the goal. It shouldn't be perfectly clean code. So saying that, this is the example that I want to go through, just a simple store function where there is some logic here. And then at the end, we're using the user model and the relation to the wire details to just save what the user has input. And if this is a simple app, this would very easily do, and we don't need to touch it and improve it. In our case, where I'm considering the possibility to extend this with additional functionality and additional payment options, keeping the code coupled like this would introduce a lot more complexity if we decide to add new functionality or change the functionality in the future. And in real life, this would have a lot more complexity to it, because it's not only saving the wire details, but it might use some external services to validate the data or do some additional checks before we save it. And this could easily blow up. So separating the responsibilities makes a lot of sense here. And simply just for the sake of the example, what we want to separate here is add a repository that will handle all of the data work, and then use that to save the details. And again, this is oversimplified example. In reality, this would likely involve services and additional checks that are better off in their own places rather than making this function much more complex and handling all at once. Then the next thing we want to do is to prevent future features from breaking our code. And this can easily happen in our scenario here because we are depending on an interface. We are implementing an interface. We have two different classes that implement the same functions, and that's all good. But we can't really ensure that the structure of this, the return, what these functions return, would be the same in both cases. And this is, for simplicity, created as an array here. This would likely be a database call in real life. But just note this style field here, which is kind of indicating the display for the field. So what would happen in the view is basically we are depending on several options here. We are taking the options on the field value and then showing the style over here. And now when we create the Payoneer method, which implements the same interface, we likely have something like this. So we have all of the fields that are required, but since this is only a single field, an email address that the user needs to fill out, we maybe thought that this style is obsolete and we don't need to add it. So we will just create the object and assume that this is handled by default. It has a fallback. And something like this would happen. So this is something that should be covered by tests. It's not something that you can clearly structure with your dependencies within the code, but it's definitely something, if you are following Solid, that you need to focus on to make sure that your code is readable, easy to maintain, easy to extend, and it complies to the list of substitution principle, meaning you can easily substitute a class that you have with another one without breaking the app. So if we imagine that we want to extend this functionality with WISE payment in the future, for example, we need to be able to add that WISE class and make sure everything works out of the box. The fourth thing is add, don't change. And this combines the dependency inversion and the open-close principles of Solid, meaning that to extend the functionality of our app, we need to add new code instead of changing existing one. And the reason for this is that when you change existing code, you cannot have control over what happens or what issues you introduce, especially if you're dealing with coupled legacy code where a change in one place can introduce many other issues elsewhere. So in our example, we have the store method here, which is checking if the selected payment type is wire, and then if so, we are creating a new wire object. If the payment type is Payoneer, we're creating a new Payoneer object. This is something that would happen in the controller. And again, if this is a simple app, this would easily do. But in our case, we need to extend this more easily in the future and ensure that our code is easy to maintain and extend in the long run. So what we want to do here instead is to depend on the abstractions, to depend on the interface so that our controller doesn't have any clue about what happens under the hood. If we go back to single responsibility, the single responsibility of our controller is to control the flow, so getting the input and returning the output. And what we want to do here is to abstract everything else so that our controller is only responsible of that controlling that flow. So what would happen instead of making an instance of the class directly, we would do this. Depend on the payment option interface here. So in the constructor, we are injecting the abstraction, the payment option interface. And then this payment option is instantiated in the background. We will look into that shortly. After this, we have the store option, which is simply using the payment option. And everything else happens in the background. So the controller doesn't have any idea about what happens in this payment, with this payment option class, with the implementation of this payment option and how it's stored. It only knows that this is what I can rely on to handle what I need to handle. And there's a very nice example about open-close principle and depending on abstractions. It's like having a socket in your room, and then to plug in your laptop, you only need to know that you can use that socket. You don't need to know how electricity works. It's the same with code. If we are handling everything within the controller, it's basically like wiring everything under the wall just to connect to plug in our laptops. We don't need that. We need to know the interface, the abstraction that we can rely on, and then utilize it without passing all the information throughout our application. And this is what makes the app simple. This is what makes it easy to extend it in the future and to maintain it on the long run, because you know exactly where your code is located, how it works, which part does which thing, and you don't have this coupling where all of these dependencies are creating problems in unexpected places. And this is what happens in the service provider. So we're binding the payment option abstraction to the concrete implementation, depending on the user selection. And what would happen now with all of this setup, with all of the structure within our code made for easy extensibility and maintenance, we could easily add a new payment option just by adding new code. So what it would take is adding another condition here for payment type wise, for example, then creating that wise class, which would implement the payment option interface, and everything would work out of the box. That would mean that we don't have a risk to break any existing functionality because we don't touch the existing code. And it would mean that it would be much faster to implement new features in the future and kind of bring positive surprises. Dan mentioned Ken Beck. That was a statement that he made in our interview, basically ensure that our team delivers these positive surprises, because it's very easy for them to create new functionality because their code allows them to. And that's all good, but what happens when you inherit a coupled code? How can you deal with it? Because we all know it's very easy, solid, when you do them as a clean slate or on a side project. You can easily organize everything and make sure it all follows the best practices. But in real life, sometimes you inherit code that's coupled. Other times you are just under so much time pressure that you consciously make trade-offs and write poorly written code just for the sake of speed. What we want to do here is avoid the urge to refactor fully the legacy code. And I mean, developers, when we see coupled code, when we see legacy code, we just want to rewrite all of it. And we always think that having a clean slate would allow us to just do things the right way. In reality, the second scenario applies. So whenever we start clean, if it's a real life project, a lot of things happen. There's a lot of context that we may not have when we begin a feature, or there is a lot of, like, all of the things that we mentioned at the beginning can contribute to messing up our code. And with that, just making it much harder to deliver features fast or be highly performing as a team. So what we want to do when it comes to legacy code is to work with the code, not against it. We don't want to spend time improving code that we don't need to change. We don't want to spend time changing code that actually works and that hasn't been touched in a while, because that is stable code, a code that has been working for a while and has been tested for so long by users. It's better off like that than changing it without any safety net, because you can easily omit features that you don't understand from the complexity of the code. And you can easily remove functionality by refactoring something that doesn't need to be refactored. So we want to work with the code, and we want to do incremental improvements of things that we touch. What that would mean is whenever we need to implement new functionality, for example, we comply with all of the rules we were talking about earlier, with all of the solid design principles, so that our code can be easy to read, easy to maintain, easy to extend, test it, and follow basically all of the best practices of software development to ensure that we can much more easily extend it in the future. And then connect that with our legacy system. So in the same context, this is an example that I want to look at. It's for processing payment, and it's again connected to our example of wire payments and Payoneer payments. So here, kind of mimicking legacy code, we want to look at a function for processing the payment, which would be part of some separate service class for payment processing. And then over here, we just have all of the conditions listed. All of them are handled through the user object. We have various different methods. So if we had a clean slate, we wouldn't organize our code in this way. But since we don't, and we inherited this, we need to work with it. So what we want to do, imagine we need to add new functionality that would be referral payments. So for every person that receives a payment monthly, and this is something that we do as a function, we have as a functionality at Adiva. So everyone can introduce their friends and receive ongoing referral bonuses for the contribution to our community. And we want to tie this with the payment. So whenever we are issuing a payment, we are also checking for referrals and adding that to the payments. Since this referral thing is new, it's a new functionality that we want to add to the platform, we want to sprout it. And what this means is that we want to create it as a separate new piece of our code and then connect it to the original code. So like kind of like a sprout connected to the old plant. this is what it means in terms of code. So we have this process payment, the same method that I just showed. But then over here, we are adding this line where we are calculating the referral bonus. And what this means is that for this referral service, for this referral bonus, we are creating a new referral service where we have that separate method for calculating the bonus. And we're not going to look into the details of what this does. The important thing is that this referral service would comply with all of the guidance we discussed earlier. So it would implement the functionality in a way that we can have single responsibility and add new functionality by adding new code, and have the possibility for extending the code easily or substituting the code easily in the future. So everything that we covered would be covered in this referral service. It would be tested, it would be implemented following all of this best practices. And then we are just adding it to our legacy code as a separate line. And if we do this for all of the new functionality, we could very easily improve the part of the code that gets changed often and come up with code that is much easier to read and much easier to understand. So just the small improvements that come whenever a new functionality comes. And the problem with legacy is that oftentimes when we see how tangled the code is and how coupled and hard to read and understand, we are inclined to continue writing it in this way. So we are just contributing to the same mess because we don't know where to start from. And the thing here is to start small. So we need to add small improvements whenever we need to touch the code because they compound. And over a year, there is an interesting stat about legacy code. If you just do 1% improvement over a sprint, you can have 30% improvement over the course of a year, which is huge. And it is something worth looking at because you would still be able to, even if you inherit a legacy code base, you would still be able to get challenged as an engineer and write things in the fashion that you want to write it, as if you would have a clean slate, and just find ways to incorporate it within your legacy code. And then another tactic that we can use for extending legacy code with additional functionality is to wrap the old code. And this would usually happen if you want to extend it with some functionality that includes adding something before the existing code base and after the existing code base. So calling two different things before and after the original functionality happens. So what we have here, that's process payment method that we had. So this is the same method, just copied over here. It's renamed to process payment legacy. And what this basically means is that we are just moving all of the old code into a new function, which is like a temporary function or a function that we want to include in our existing method. So the process payment is now changed in a way that it does something. So over here, again, we have this referral service that we are using. Then we are calling the original payment processing method. And after that, we want to return certain response. So to make sure that this function is kind of improved in a way that will allow us to easily extend our code in the future with this adapted response. But also, we don't want to go ahead and refactor all of this here because one change within the legacy payment processing function could introduce maybe 10 other changes elsewhere. And all of those are related to something else and can break something else. So we don't want to do that, especially not when we are pressed with time. We want to work with our existing code. If this process payment method works as expected, if it returns the wanted result, great. We just want to reuse that, but reuse that in a way that will enable us to have this safety net for all of the future functions that we are going to write, all of the future code that we're going to write, to ensure that all of the new code is well written and easy to understand and extend, while at the same time keep the functionality that is well tested and that can be easily reused, so that we don't need to invest time where it's not necessary. And diving much further into this in my Laravel code. So if you are interested to dig further or understand more, there are a lot of other interesting tactics that you can use for working with legacy code, because there is a lot of content out there that talks about how to write good code, and a lot of engineers debating on what good code is and what are the best practices, how you should write your code or test your code or anything. But a lot of those are missing the context of real life projects. To understand how you can deliver value fast and ship new features fast and have a team that's highly performing, you need to understand all of the nuances of the project and the customer needs, and need to balance between speed and quality and resolve tech debt and all of that. So I think it's very important to understand when you need to work on polishing the code and when you actually need to work with your existing code and just ensure that you continuously improve, so that in the future you can much more easily deliver new features, which is the main thing why we work as engineers. So that's all for me. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
All right. Thank you very much, Katerina. That was excellent. Lots of stuff there. Yeah, definitely in terms of how we can structure our code and how we can structure our applications to make it easier to work on, right? Which kind of leads to that improvement in developer experience. And then I think you kind of touched on this, but kind of my first question when you started talking about that was like when you gave the example of sort of like a greenfield project versus like, well, that's all well and good, but the real world often is that you're into like a legacy application with some really challenging bits to work on. Any thoughts of just like if you find yourself in that situation and then you come into this application that's processing payments and making money for a client, but there's no tests in place and it's really hard to work with? Where do you even start? Do you have any general advice for where to even start that process of what's the first thing we could maybe work on?
Well, I would say we need to understand first the context of the project and the needs of the customers and what we need to work on right now, because a lot of times when we deal with legacy code and those static analysis and all of that, you are just getting into the mindset that you need to improve the old code base. And this has happened with us at Adiva, and a lot of times we've had the challenge of, we work on a new feature, but there is some underlying thing that is blocking us, or it's making it harder to deliver this. So maybe we need to refactor. And how much do you refactor? If you look into the code and you start improving it, then you'll find something else that you need to work on and something else that you need to work on. And this often results in significant delays. So instead of doing that, I would just say there is some interesting approach for testing legacy code, which is called characterization testing. And it only verifies if the code is working as expected. So it doesn't test the whole function, but it tests the output, basically. And you can easily do this with snapshot testing. I think there's a package, Spotty has a package for that. You can easily introduce this type of tests for your legacy code, just to introduce that safety with the old code that you're about to change. And then whenever you do a change, you run the test and ensure that the response is as you were expecting it. And the other thing, when you improve the existing code or when you change, refactor something, just do that when you actually need it. If you, like in the example that we just went through, when you work on something that touches existing legacy code, think about whether this code needs to change, or is it a stable piece of code that has not changed in years or months, and it doesn't require any additional improvements because it works well just as is. So in this case, you can easily wrap the code and reuse it basically as some kind of library that you would include externally. And I would think about the legacy code like that, because even if it doesn't have tests, it has been very well tested by the users over time. And if it hasn't changed in a while, that means that it's very stable and you can easily use it as is.
Yeah, it's a very good point about the often think about that when you're changing some old piece of code. It'd be like, this might be ugly and nasty looking and tough to work with, but at the same time, like, it's been used by so many people, and I've definitely run into times when I've, there's one particular line of code, be like, well, this isn't needed, we'll get rid of that, but that was there because there was some other error, way above in the code and things like that. So you definitely want to be very cautious when you start approaching, like, even touching legacy code. And I think the point you make is a good one. Is like, can we get a basic like snapshot test? Just, we don't even care necessarily. There might be bugs in this code. There might be errors in the logic, but could we just capture what it's outputting and make sure that it keeps outputting that? And at least we know it's continuing to work the way it does. And then we can kind of maybe take that approach that you'd said of like sprouting some new code for anything new we need to work with, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's funny how you mentioned how it depends on the client, what kind of red tape you're going to run into. But if you even think internally from like the company that you work with and the team that you work with, kind of keeping that mindset, like, how does organization culture impact the developer experience? And then what cultural changes have you seen that positively affect developer experience within an organization?
Well, I think the developer experience, if we talk about the culture, it depends a lot on those things that we mentioned at the beginning, like understanding of the big picture and passing on the vision to the team. And the managers, are they working with the team, or they're focused on the business and the metrics and everything, but they're not doing anything that can actually contribute to the speed of delivering new features, because that's their main goal. So I would say that context switching and understanding of the big picture are the two biggest things from cultural perspective that can influence the developer experience and the performance of the team. Because if you don't understand the big picture of what you're developing, if you get a task, a small piece of the functionality that you need to work on, but you're not aware of how this contributes, it's not only about team morale, but it also affects the way that you are able to structure your code with the future changes in mind. So if you know what this would imply in the future, or how this would develop in the future, you would likely implement it in a certain way that you might miss right now and make it harder for you to extend it in the future. And then about context switching, a lot of times developers work on something, but then a lot of other things pop up during their day-to-day that don't allow them to actually produce significant piece of work. And managers are often not aware of this. So I would also say focusing on that and working together with the team. I think that is the main thing, really, and the team to be able to speak up and share whatever is bothering them and disabling them from creating more value.
Oh, that's interesting. I think of like mob programming when you say things like that, where it helps when everyone is working together to gain context rather than having small individual meetings for everyone to get caught up. But when you do things like mobbing, people can get that context as well. I don't know if you've tried that, but that's what came to mind.
I haven't, but a lot of people mention it lately that I really want to dive deeper into it.
The thing you mentioned, Katerina, about the organization kind of sharing the big picture, I think is one that when I was a less experienced developer, I didn't appreciate as much. And I think we've all probably felt this as developers at times. If you're working on a project that has a process and a project manager and tickets and things like that, there's a part of me, at least, that wants to just kind of take the ticket, and hopefully the ticket has everything I need. I'm just going to do this work and put my head down and now this the button is on the page now, here you go. But definitely you grow to appreciate that, even if you don't need to concern yourself with some of the finer aspects of the bigger picture, understanding the bigger picture, even if you're working on a very low level feature, can have such a positive impact on even the software development, right? Even down to, like, if I understand what this epic of work is for and what we're trying to accomplish for the end users, it might dictate, the feedback I give from clicking on a button, even something that low level, right? And I think that that's a big one. It's just like trying to let's work together. It's all about collaboration, and let's share the vision that you have. And I think at Vehicle, for instance, as a software consultancy, we try to do that a lot with our clients, right? Because we're often an extension of their team, and that's one of the first things we try to understand when we start working with a client, and as we're building specific features of like, what's the company's vision? What does the company want to get out of this, so that we can help deliver on that and have that same vision. Yeah, absolutely. All right, we have there was a question in the chat here I want to add. And this was giving when you had your slides and you were showing the different kind of payment providers, and it says actions, or that kind of actions pattern. If you're familiar with that, where you kind of like can extract a bunch of logic into maybe an invocable class. Actions can help organization of your code, but beware getting lost in payment options implementation specific. This was just sort of a suggestion. Maybe each implementation can handle its own details. Any thoughts or corrections are welcome. Do you have any thoughts about that approach? I think in the example you gave, there was some sort of details being passed into these payment processors. So maybe this is just sort of a question along the lines of, how do you know where to draw the lines of those abstractions, right? Something like that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not really sure how to answer it though.
That actually kind of made me think specifically of a Laravel application. Are there any specific features within a Laravel application that make implementing some of the things that you talked about in your slides easier? Have you run into anything you'd be like, man, I really like that Laravel has this feature because it allows me to do this thing, easily when I'm trying to work with a legacy code base? Any thoughts there?
Well, to be honest, I haven't been very hands-on with programming at all lately. I'm more involved with within the team, managing everything, so more of a high level. And I really try to keep up through this type of talks and courses and everything. So I'm not sure of a Laravel functionality that we can we would use to do that right, except for the bindings that are very easy to use for dependency inversion and everything. So in framework class structure, I would use factories and stuff to implement all of that, and Laravel makes it very easy to handle out of the box. But apart from that, I wouldn't be able to share any specific example right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I think I saw actually someone mentioned in the chat when you were talking about that, and you showed that example specifically of the service provider determining which of the payment providers to sort of instantiate and put into the container. And somebody said, "Thank you, Laravel," in the chat, and I agree. Right? That's one of the things that Laravel makes so easy to do, right? To wire up your dependencies through service providers. Another one I've run into just on the topic of like kind of dealing with old stuff and trying to make it new is just on like Laravel models within Eloquent, like the accessors, where you can say like get first name attribute, get last name attribute, things like that. I've dealt with sometimes with legacy projects with very ugly looking database schema, very inconsistent column names, table names, things like that. So that's one feature I've leaned on definitely. That's a cool one. If the ID field had some weird name with extra characters or something, just having a get ID attribute field on the user model or whatever allows you to abstract some of that away and almost like write your code looking to the future before the database schema has actually been changed. So I'm sure there's a lot of other examples we could drive out, but yeah, there's definitely a couple that come to mind there. Margaret, did you have anything else here that you see question wise?
Yeah, no, those are all the questions that I saw there come so far in the chat. But just a reminder, anyone here too, if they have any further questions, we could also say them later, or Katerina, we can let you know later on, and we could probably post them later on in the description of the YouTube video as well.
There is definitely a question I have here that, and this is again classic, doing client work, especially as you're working as a consultancy. If you want to spend some time to sort of, do the classic pay down some technical debt, clean up the code to make it easier to work with. That can be a tough sell sometimes to stakeholders, right? Of like, well, we're going to do a bunch of work. It's going to work the exact same, right? Any thoughts, any tips, any winning strategies you've had with like how to sell that to stakeholders of what the long-term benefit's going to be to making these improvements now?
Well, trying to talk from business perspective always helps, because developers often focus on their side. Like it's very difficult to work with the code, and there's a lot of tech debt that we need to resolve and everything. And it also connects to the moment of how much we need to deal with, because refactoring the whole thing versus improving certain thing that we need to work with really makes a lot of difference in terms of the time we need to spend and the buy-in that we need from the management. So I would say, like, if we talk about it from business perspective or user perspective, how much could this help us in the future to deliver features faster, or how much slower would it be right now, instead of basically explain the trade-off. We need to spend 2 more days right now, but that would save us 2 weeks later on when we need to do this and that. I think that would make it much easier for the managers to understand it. And we mentioned my chat with Kat earlier. He talked a lot about this, so maybe I can refer a reading. There is this book, Tidy First. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I think he released it last year, and he's now working on some follow-up for managers and executives as well. It covers a lot about this. So how can you balance between the time you need to spend on feature development versus the time you need to spend on improving the code so that you can deliver features more easily and faster in the future. And he has a lot of good tips about this and how you can communicate with the management. So I can recommend it as a read.
Awesome. Yeah, that does sound like a very good resource. Okay. Cool. I just personally had one kind of final question. You'd mentioned like at one point the vision, right? If we come into a legacy code base and we want to improve it, and maybe we can take a step back and kind of identify some spots where, hey, longer term we could move in this direction and improve this spot here. We could clean up this controller by doing X and Y. Do you have any thoughts? Because I've definitely been on projects where there's some vision, but the whole team isn't aware of the vision, or the vision might be documented, but the team doesn't know about the documentation. Do you have any thoughts of like effective ways to sort of share that vision with the team, so that if I go to work on something, I know that, hey, I should probably take this approach to this thing because this is what we want to do as a team? Any thoughts on sharing that vision?
Yeah, whose vision is it? Is it an
I'm
architect?
Yeah, I'm thinking kind of from a developer standpoint, right? Of like, hey, we've identified this controller, like the example you gave. This controller's kind of nasty. There's a whole bunch of logic here that should be probably extracted to a service or a payment provider or something. How can we share that vision with the team? Because we don't want to make all the changes now, like you said. We want to kind of make the changes as we need to, as we touch the code. But how can we share that vision with the team so that we're all on the same page? And months down the road, if someone goes to work on that code, they kind of understand what we want to do with that code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying, like, if I as a developer notice that something needs to be done in the future but not right now,
Yes.
how can I as an individual communicate it, right?
Yeah, or maybe even you can only do part of the job now because you're adding a new provider, but we'd like to come back and clean this up here. How can I best share that with my team so that we all have that kind of shared vision?
Well, I guess it's about mindset. You're asking a lot of difficult questions.
I'm sorry. It's just the stuff I run into every day, so it's we deal with it, right? So
yeah. I guess it's the mindset and the structure within the team. So just to align on how you want to deal with all of these things, and first to align on the vision that, okay, we need to do continuous improvements, and we want to do continuous improvements on the code. Whenever I touch something, I want to adjust that, to tidy it first, as we mentioned, basically to improve the code just slightly so that I can easily add this functionality, and that becomes a mindset. It becomes part of the day-to-day work and something that you don't even need to justify to managers, because it's easy to do. Once you do that, you would likely encounter some bigger pieces that need to be refactored or need more time. It's good to have an alignment here with management as well on how can you dedicate to these pieces of work. I've talked to a lot of companies that have sprints for feature work and then some cool off periods for working on things like this. So they document tag that somewhere and prioritize it properly so that they can spend a sprint or something working on this and improving it. or you could spend a portion, like 30% of a sprint, every sprint dealing with things like this. But the main thing is to agree with the team on how you document these things and how you want to deal with them. And so after that, you can have a proper schedule and a way to deal with them as you work on the other stuff. So I don't think there is a one size fits all solution, but I always like to think of all of this in terms of trade-offs. Like you spend time on something and that means that you don't have time for something else. So how do you want to deal with it? And how much of the time you invest right now would pay off in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a good point of just not staying focused also on what you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to actually deliver, and not because it's that classic analogy you said, well, you fix this, then you fix this, and it's like renovating a house, right? We tear this wall open and this wall, and before you know it, we're down to the studs in every room, and that wasn't the plan, right? We just wanted to do the kitchen. So yeah, absolutely. All right. I think that's all I have. Any other questions you see there, Margaret?
Yeah. No. So I'm good for questions as well.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Katerina, for coming in and sharing your insights. I think these are the team dynamics things are stuff that we deal with every day in the software world. And I think definitely a strong message there of like, spend some time to tidy things up as you go. And it's going to make things over the long haul just that much easier. But there's no quick fixes, right? It's like you said, if you can just do 1% at a time, you're going to get there in the long haul. But kind of coming up with that vision and then working on it as a team can definitely improve your experience over time. So thank you very much for sharing your insights today, Katerina.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. We'll send you on your way. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right. That was awesome. Thank you once again, Katerina, for joining us. So we're going to move right into our second speaker for this month. The speaker, like we said, is a fellow Vehicalian, Felipe Flor. He's a Brazilian, now in Canada. He is a full stack developer here at Vehicle. He's been a speaker at the Vue.js, official Vue.js conference, VueConf US in the past. Felipe also has a course on viewschool.io, which deals specifically with test-driven development with Vue 3 and vtest, entitled A Wordle on Test-Driven Development. So go ahead and check that out if you want to see some approaches to TDD on the Vue.js side of things. And Felipe's been gracious enough to come and join us today and share his passion and love for testing on the Laravel side of things. How's it going today, Felipe?
Hey there, folks. Can you hear me just fine?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Hey,
awesome. Yeah,
pleasure to be here.
Yes, like we said. So today, Felipe, you want to share some insight on Fluent Assertions and kind of how you've been working with those in your Laravel tests. And I think anyone, especially that's dealing with JSON APIs and Laravel and things like that, are going to get something out of this. So I think you've shared your screen here, Felipe, I believe. Let's make sure. Is this the right one? Can you see that?
Perfect.
All right. There we go. Do you need anything else, or are we good here?
No, I think we're good to go. Is that okay?
Well, yeah, we're going to step backstage. Take it away, Felipe. Looking forward to it. Talk to you shortly.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, folks. Hey there. I'm really happy to be here today speaking at Laravel Worldwide. And my plan for the next 20 to 30 minutes is going to be to share a little bit on why I love Laravel Fluent Assertions and Fluent Assertions in general. If you haven't heard of that term before, that's totally all right. The way I've prepared this talk is that there should be something for you to take away from it, even if you're not experienced writing tests for Laravel. All right. So my name is Felipe Flor. I was born in Brazil, but I've been living in Canada for about a decade now. And like Dan said, I am a part of a group of very talented developers at Vehicle. And just like my colleagues, I am very passionate about Laravel and writing tests in general. Dan also mentioned, and yes, I've recently become a instructor at Vue School. I worked in collaboration with Daniel Kelly, the amazing folks at Vue School, and also my friends at Vehicle. And together we've put a course that teaches the principles of test-driven development while we make a Wordle game from scratch. It was a lot of fun putting it together, and it's been truly an amazing opportunity. But okay, so how are we going to be approaching this today? I'm going to make an example app that's going to have a series of requirements that we need to fulfill, and that's going to be what's going to drive our tests. Well, I also wanted to do a brief discussion about what are Fluent assertions and how they differ from what I'm going to be calling traditional assertions. Then we're going to have a section where I'm going to explain how we can do Fluent JSON assertions. So if you're testing APIs, and how you can do Fluent DOM assertions if you're testing views. Our app is going to be a message board. So a user that authenticates in our app should be able to post a message in there, and anybody, even people who are not authenticated, should be able to see the messages in the board. If the client is asking for application JSON as opposed to text HTML, we should provide to them a JSON payload back. And what are some requirements that we're going to be exploring? Let's say that the timestamps, the card should have timestamps, and it should be in a human-friendly format. I also don't want to be sharing the emails of everyone that is using our app. So let's say that you must be an administrator to be able to see the author's emails. I also want to include another requirement in here that if you are the person who is authenticated right now, instead of seeing your full name, we should just see the word you appearing in there. And that should give us enough requirements to play around today. But yes, what are Fluent assertions? I've done some research, and overall, at the heart of it, the way the community defines Fluent assertions is a combination of two main principles. They have a chainable syntax, and what I mean by this is when you make an assertion, that assertion returns something that you can make an assertion from, and so on and so on. And they should read like natural language. So you shouldn't require like a technical knowledge on that testing framework to be able to kind of understand what the testing is asserting, right? And I have amazing news. Yes, Laravel introduced the Fluent JSON object in 2020, right? The Fluent assertion is great, but it's not a replacement to the traditional ones. The traditional ones are still valuable. But I want to show like how a traditional JSON test would look like before Laravel 8. And it would look like this. And as you can see, I'm not chaining those methods because they're traditional. Nah, I'm just kidding. You can chain it. Like you could chain them for a very long time. You can just connect them with the arrows. And here we go. So the traditional test response assertions were already chainable. And I guess this is a matter of opinion, but I feel like the tests are very, like the assertion functions, even the traditional ones, are very well named, and they're pretty expressive, and they read like natural language in some, like for the most case, like assert C, assert don't see. And in this case, I want to assert that that JSON section is an array. So what is going on? Why did Laravel announce in 2020 that Fluent JSON assertions are available now for Laravel 8? There is 2 points that I want to drive here. One is that I was vague on purpose on my definition of Fluent assertions. What I said a few slides back is not enough to define it. And the second one is that Laravel is awesome. Yes, even before the assertable JSON object was released, we already had very well expressive assertion names that were chainable. And that's why it's such a pleasure to work with Laravel for testing. The tests are very expressive, very easy to maintain and read. So what did the assertable JSON object bring to the table? Well, what it brings to the table is things that allow it to be what I'm going to define now as a strict definition of what Fluent means. Okay? So what are Fluent assertions in a strict sense? Yes, it still needs to be chainable, and it still needs to read like natural language. But here's a point as well. The natural language and the chainable syntax really work together. You're chaining multiple assertions functions, and you're making a sentence in English, effectively. The assertion functions are made to be used in conjunction. Does that make sense? Like, I'm going to clarify this with some examples, but that's an important point there. And another thing that I want to mention, and I absolutely love this in this Fluent assertion methods, is that the scope of the assertion can be narrowed within the chain flow. And I feel like I'm talking a bunch of gibberish. Like I'm going to give an example to clarify what I mean. Let's say that I want to make a test about the place that I live in. So I can say, hey, assert Felipe lives in an apartment. Okay, now for the apartment, I want to assert that it has a kitchen and it has a bedroom. Okay, now I'm going to narrow the scope for the bedroom. I hope the bedroom has at least one window. With that, if there is a window in the kitchen, but there isn't a window in my bedroom, the test is going to fail. And that's great, because somebody reading that test can see, okay, we are looking to see if there is a window on Felipe's bedroom. Like, that's the expressiveness and the clear syntax that I love about those Fluent assertions. Let me show you what I mean. So this is an example test that I wrote for the API side of things for that board app. By the way, I just want to give a shout out to the fact that PHP Unit now supports PHP attributes. So you don't have to use doc blocks if you want to announce a data provider, for example. It's a nice improvement. I really like this. I hope more and more things are going to be using PHP attributes. But this first part of the test over here is I'm effectively making the setup. So it's what we call the arrange phase. I'm populating the database with a bunch of cards, and then I'm going to act as someone who is not an administrator. So it's either a guest, also known as a user that is not authenticated, or a user that has a role that is not an admin. So because we're going to test to see that if you're not an admin, you should not be able to see the emails of the authors. And this over here is where the act and the assert phases of the test happen. So I'm going to pull a CSI in here. I'm going to enhance. And there we go. We can focus on this. So as you can see on the act phase, I'm asking the server to give me a JSON payload back for the index of cards. So the list of the cards in the system. And then I call this method assert JSON. And assert JSON is very special because what it does is you can use it in traditional mode or Fluent mode. And you choose the mode that you want to use based on what you provide to it. If you pass an associative array to it, it runs in traditional mode. And what I mean by this, it's like if you're familiar with testing JSON in traditional assertions, it's similar to assert JSON fragment, but it's a little bit more forgiving. It allows the fragment that you define itself to be incomplete in relation to what you got. But like this can be a whole talk on itself. What I want to talk about is what happens when you pass a callback to it. And when you pass a callback to it, you're running this in Fluent mode. And this method is going to inject into your callback an assertable JSON object. And this is what's going to allow you to do the Fluent assertions. Now the word is our oyster, right? I want to collapse this core part for now, and I want to focus on the outside of this test. So let's look into this. You can see over here that I'm asserting that the payload that I get back from the server has a key of data in it. And then, just like the bedroom example I gave earlier, I can make assertions on what this data should contain. We can go there in a second. But I also want to point out to this etc. function. What this etc. function does is you're communicating to PHP Unit that it can disregard any additional keys at that same level. And this is very important. So I wanted to dedicate a slide to this. Let's say that I have a JSON payload that is coming back from my server, and it contains data with a bunch of data connected to it, and then something else. Let's say it's metadata for the pagination. Something. So you have something else at the same level as data. With the test that we wrote before, if we assume that all the requirements are properly implemented for the data part, this test is going to pass. If we remove the etc., again, assuming that all the requirements from the data part are implemented, this test is going to fail because I did not specify assertions for the something else key. Folks, this is really important because what it allows you to do is to focus on what actually matters for the test at hand. You don't want to be cluttering your test with a bunch of unrelated assertions. It's going to make your test harder to understand. So I do want to give a disclaimer here. The test that I'm using for this slide has clutter in it. Like as I mentioned earlier, the point of this test is to ensure that if you're not an administrator, you should not be able to see the email. But I'm checking to see if the card has a title or the card has a body. Like this is clutter. So do keep that in mind. I'm including multiple of those functions calls for the sake of saving time in the presentation, but this could be refactored. But all right, another thing that I want to mention is this each method in here. This is pretty useful. Like it's a pretty powerful assertion method, because what you're doing in here is you are asserting that every single element in that selection are abiding to the rules that you defined following up. Okay, so every single card in that data key, so I'm effectively communicating to someone who is reading this test as like, oh, okay, the JSON payload has a data key, and data contains an array of cards. Like you can see how your test reads naturally. And now I can say, okay, every single card should contain an author key, and the author key should not have the email in it. Just like that. So again, just to recap, if we use the missing function, we are asserting that it does not have that key. If we use the has function, we are asserting that it contains that key. And if you're using the etc. function, you're disregarding the presence or not of any other keys beyond the ones that you specified. All right, so this first part, I was just talking about how we can make assertions to see if a specific key is defined. How about asserting for values? In a traditional way, we could use, for example, in this case, this test is checking that the timestamps are in a human-friendly format. Assert JSON path is a great way to achieve this. It supports the dot notation, and I can just say, yes, for the very first card in that payload, check to see that the timestamp is in a human-friendly format. There you go. This is a very easy to understand test, simple to maintain. Laravel has kept like this amazing pattern around for years. But if you want to refactor that to use a Fluent assertion, one way you could do it is by doing this. So I'm calling the assert JSON function, and from my assertable JSON, I can use the where function. And guess what? Where function supports the dot notation as well. So this looks very similar to what we saw before. But what if you don't like to use the dot notation? You could still use the nested callback. So I'm just going to push this to the side and show a different refactor of this. So we could get the JSON payload, then navigate to data, and then from the array of data, get the first result. And in there, for that very first card, I can see that the timestamps are in a human-friendly format, just like that. But all right, so I'm going to put Fluent JSON assertions on pause for now, and I want to change routes a little bit to using Fluent assertions to test Blade. So our front end looks like this. So we have a list of cards appearing on the screen. I want to focus on a specific card. More precisely, let's focus on the header. And what I want the header of the card to fulfill is that it should show the topic title. It should show the timestamps in a human-friendly format, and it should show the author's name. In a traditional test response assertion way, we could write a test that looks like this. And you can see that I'm visiting the card index page, and then I'm asserting that I see the author's name, I see the topic title, and I see the timestamp in a human-friendly format. Very easy to understand, direct to the point. This is an awesome test, easy to follow. But there is one area for improvement here. This test is not enforcing structure. And this test has a non-negligible chance of false positives. And what do I mean by false positives? I mean that the test is passing, but the feature is failing. The real feature itself is failing if you test on the app. To demonstrate my point, imagine the following scenario. Let's say that the author's name is Will. And if I assert that I see Will, if anywhere in the HTML of this page the word will is being rendered, the test is going to pass, even if we're not rendering the author's name on the card. So how can we make this test more robust, right? In 2022, René Simbeck has published a package called Laravel DOM Assertions. And folks, I love this because like what it does is effectively it adds a couple of macros to the Laravel's test response and the test view objects to provide them with Fluent assertion methods. So the second part of the presentation, I'm going to show you why I love this and why you should try it out. On the topic of trying it out, I'm going to include on the lower right of the screen a link to it. So it's going to stay there. I strongly recommend checking it out. It's totally worth it. And I also want to use this moment to give a huge shout out to René. The guy is awesome, really fun to talk with, and he really has this personality of being eager to help people around. You don't have to take my word for it. Like he's one of the top contributors in the Laracasts forum. And when I reached out to him on Twitter, mentioning that I wanted to do a talk on his package, he was really happy to connect with me and to provide me with assistance. I took this screenshot over here of a call that we had. I had his permission, by the way, and it was a lot of fun. Like, honestly, I just want to give a shout out to the guy. Thank you so much, René. And I know you're watching this talk, so I just want to say hi. But all right, so what can we do with Laravel DOM assertions? This is the traditional test that we're talking about before, right? I can refactor this to look like this. Now, look at it. I'm using this assert element exists method, just like we were using the assert JSON method before. So what this does is you pass a callback to it, and it gives you an assertable, an assert element object from which you can use Fluent assertions. Okay, so I'm going to use this assert object to navigate to the first card that I can find. Then I can navigate to the header. And then in the header, I can make assertions. And I can say, like, I hope it contains the author's name. I hope it contains the topic's title. And it contains the timestamps. So by using this package, we've managed to make this test a little bit more robust. I also want to mention that even though I'm using over here a custom HTML attribute to identify the card, you can use any valid CSS selector as you're using this package. It actually runs with Symfony CSS selector under the hood. So yes, you don't have to be limited to custom HTML attributes. You can use whatever valid CSS selector you want. All right, so let's talk about the assertions for the author name. So the author name should show up as you. The way I would write this test would be something like this. So I'm effectively, in the arrange phase, I'm populating the database with a card. Then I'm going to act as the author of that card. And if I navigate to the header of that card, and for the sake of demonstration, you can even see that I'm using a CSS selector that goes straight to the header. I can assure that it's not going to contain the author's name, and instead, it's going to contain the word you in it. It's pretty sweet. I also want to mention that Laravel DOM Assertions is an open source project. And I'm really happy to say that I've managed to provide a little contribution to it a few days ago by adding the each method to this package. And effectively, the each method behaves just like the each method in the assertable JSON object. So just to recap, what it means is that you're going to be ensuring that every single element within the given selection is going to fulfill the requirements that you're specifying afterwards. So in the case of this example here, I'm just ensuring that every single image in my page has an alt tag. What about Livewire? And like, I absolutely love Livewire. And if you haven't heard of it before, what effectively is a means to you to write dynamic frontend while staying behind in PHP land. So it abstracts away some of the JavaScript that you would need to use that. And you know what is great about this whole thing? When you're writing Livewire tests, you're using the Laravel test response. And because of the way Laravel DOM assertions was implemented, that is by adding macros to the Laravel test response, it works out of the box perfectly with Livewire. So let me demonstrate. Let's say that in our app, we have this form that the user can type in, and when they submit, they create a new card. A Livewire test that I would write would look like this. I do want to mention as well, like if you haven't heard of Vote before, it just means single file component Livewire. It's really nice. For the sake of this test, just treat this as a regular Livewire test. Like you don't need to be familiarized with Vote to see what's going on. But effectively what's going on in here is that I am mounting this component for test while being an authenticated user, okay? And then I set the values for title and body properties in my Livewire component, and then I call the store method, and I hope a given event was dispatched and that a specific entry was added to the database. This reads very nicely. And again, one thing that I think it's very important, how expressive is my test and how easy to maintain it is. And it's spot on, so good, like it reads really well. But there is one area for improvement here. We are manipulating internal properties of this component directly, which means that if our blade file is missing this connection that would allow the user to mutate the title and the body of the card, our test is going to be passing, but it's going to be a false positive. The feature itself that the user would be interacting with is not going to be there. So how can we provide this additional protection? That's where Laravel DOM assertions can come in, and I can prepend to my Livewire test a quick check to make sure that all the proper connections are in place that would allow the user to mutate the Livewire properties. So I can call the assert form exists. It's just like a search element exists, but it has a few more methods to it. In this case, it doesn't affect it too much. But in here, you can see that I'm selecting the controls from the form in which the user types information in, and I'm asserting that they have the proper wire model connections in place for the title and the body. Then I assert that there is a submit button in there, and that upon submission, this form is going to call the store method in the backend. The rest of the test continues just like we had it on the previous slide. I can set the properties and then call the store method myself. Just like that, by adding this quick check with Laravel DOM assertions, I can make sure that the connection between the front end and the back end is properly set up in place. I do want to also give a dedicated slide to the assert form exists. So as I've mentioned before, it effectively returns an element to you that is an extension of the assert element. It contains a couple of helper methods dedicated for form assertions. For example, you can assert that your form has a proper action defined, or that it contains that hidden input with the CSRF token, or that it has a specific method. And you can see over here that in this example, I'm using the delete method because yes, the has method assertion accounts for spoofed methods. If you don't know what I mean, is that effectively when you want to make a delete request in a Laravel app, the form is actually making a post request, and there is a hidden input in your form payload that tells Laravel saying like, hey, by the way, this post is actually a delete. Like that's what I mean with a spoofed method. And assert form exists already abstracts that away for you. Really nice. Yeah, and before I close up, I do want to mention as well that there is one important limitation that I want to emphasize, and is that testing your front end with a feature test, like based on a test response, works great if you're using Blade with or without Livewire. But if your front end controls are being rendered through JavaScript, so let's say a front-end framework like Vue or React, your test response is not going to have access to those controls. Okay, so you're not going to be able to properly test those. My recommendation is that if your front end is running on one of those frameworks, it's best for you to rely on testing libraries made for those specific frameworks. So if you're testing Vue, use Vue Test Utils or Vue Testing Library. If you're testing React, use React Testing Library, and so on. So you shouldn't be relying necessarily on the test response assertions in a feature test level. And I also want to emphasize that this is not a replacement for end-to-end tests either. This is just another tool set to allow your feature tests to level up a little bit more. And that's pretty much it. Honestly, it's been an amazing experience putting this talk together. And I really hope that this is going to, at the very least, motivate people to look a little bit further into it. Thank you so much.
Awesome sauce there, Felipe. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Sort of. I didn't realize quite how long it had been in Laravel. You know, I feel like the last few versions have gone more quickly than some older versions of Laravel. So didn't realize it'd been there since PHP 8. But yeah, definitely, it's about readability, right? That's the biggest thing I saw in the different examples of like different options for making your code readable in different ways depending on what you value in your assertions, I guess, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I did have a question about in terms of readability, Felipe. You gave a really good example of a couple different ways. Like, hey, we could assert this. I think you gave like the human readable form timestamp formats. We could assert it this way, or we could assert it this way, or assert it this way. Do you have any thoughts? And I guess there's a lot of subjectivity here, I recognize, but do you have any thoughts of like, what do you look for in turn to determine like how am I best to assert this? What's the most readable way to assert this thing? What do you look for when you're writing your tests?
So the thing that I like to do, and this is something that I've learned at Vehicle, is effective. Like if someone who is not a software developer were to read your test, can they kind of figure out what's going on in that test? I think this is an important guideline to try to follow. I know it's not always possible, like depending on what you're testing for, but if you can fulfill that requirement of like, hey, is it readable even for someone who is not a Laravel developer? Mm-hmm. That would be like the sweet spot.
Yeah. If it reads like, I think you were talking about natural language being one of the things you're looking for, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And on that front, I did have the thought of, there are some examples, and I think the examples you gave were pretty good. They weren't like, sometimes you see in blog posts, it's a very simple, contrived example. I think yours was a little more kind of robust in terms of the data that was in there, but I can also imagine that there would be times when you're asserting a whole lot more things, especially in those JSON assertions, right? We want to have all of these 8 fields, and these other things should have these, these fields and these values and things like that. And I'm also imagining that when you start doing that, you could get a lot of tests that the assertions start looking fairly similar in terms of like the, the different chaining and things they're looking for. Just a very general question. Have you taken any approaches or explored any ways to further kind of abstract or reuse some of those assertions?
Oh, I think so. Yes, 100%. So one of the things that we can do, like even whether you're testing on PHP words or you're testing JavaScript words, extracting abstractions that combine those series of assertions together into a sentence is so nice to do, right? So this is definitely something that I would recommend. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like let's say, for example, if there is a series of steps that you need to do to make an order, and then I can say like a search order was successfully sent. Like, and there we go. Like somebody reading that test, you can see that that's an assertion that exists.
Yeah, I think you get specific things like that. I've definitely had those sorts of tests where sometimes the simplest thing is you just add a private function within the test class, depending what framework you're using, and you could just assert, like the order has all the stuff I want in there, for lack of a better name, right? And that might do a series of things. I was even thinking some more general abstractions, right, where you could have maybe you have a series of just checking that 10 different keys exist, right? So you could have like has this, has this, has this, has this. There's probably some abstractions there where you could have some like named function at class or something that just like has all these keys, and you just pass an array of keys and things like that, right? It's probably a lot of really interesting possibilities there. And when you were talking about too the DOM assertions package, I was thinking in my head and I checked, and then you said it before I could even find the answer. I was like, this must be using the macro ability of the test response class, right? So for those that maybe aren't aware, the test response class that we get back when we call API methods or functions in a Laravel test has a bunch of things we can assert off of it, right? And it's also macroable, meaning that we can add functions to it, right? So I think there's some opportunities there maybe for like adding your own macroable functions to your own test response class to do those specific assertions, right?
Exactly. Yeah, like a project specific. Yeah, macros.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sorry. So just to clarify, can you integrate these kind of assertions using like built-in Laravel testing, like PHP unit or Dust or anything like that?
No, yeah, exactly. So because when you're writing a feature test in Laravel, you instantiate the Laravel app, like you create the Laravel application. And when you make like a GET request to endpoint, what Laravel is going to give that to is a test response object. And it has a bunch of different helper methods in it. And if you want to, and I think that's what Dan was talking about, is that there is this concept of a macro, which is effectively like you're adding additional functions to an existing object. And you could write project-specific macros for the test response that are kind of like, yeah, in the context of this web store that we're working on, here is an assertion that is dedicated for testing web store stuff. Like you could extend that. Yeah.
And that can be, I was just thinking, this kind of connects actually to our previous talk that Katerina gave about specifically working and testing legacy code. I've definitely on many occasions run into an application, a legacy application, where there's something strange going on. The way that, you expect a certain thing to work might not work exactly that way in that application because of some specific thing and the way it was configured within that application, right? And so if you need to account for that sometimes in like your test assertions, that can be very repetitive across your tests, right? Always having to check for the same thing or something like that. So that's another option there where you could abstract that sort of logic to one specific spot, have that specific weird check there. You can just call a nice named assertion in your test. It reads very nicely. And then if you ever refactor the code down the road, you just have one spot to go in and change that assertion and how you're asserting that an order has everything it needs or that a blog post was saved successfully, whatever the use case may be.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I want to clarify as well is that like writing tests is not an exact science. So there is a lot of a lot of thought that needs to be put into it, because one of the guidelines that it's usually recommended by the community is your test should be asserting for one responsibility as much as possible. But yes, we do need to account for that sometimes that one responsibility that your test is checking for is a combination of assertions put together. So I just want to give this clarification to the folks listening to this talk, just to avoid any misconceptions there. But yes, exactly.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's unavoidable in my experience by nature. Your tests are at times going to be a little more long-winded than maybe your application code. There's going to be more lines there than you need, that you'd prefer maybe. But I think ultimately tests are about, the way I've heard it put best, I think tests are about giving the developer confidence that the thing they're working on isn't breaking or it's working the way they want it to, right? And that's ultimately the goal there. If the code needs to be not the prettiest looking to get that accomplished, so be it. But I think there are, like, you showed, there's lots of opportunities to make that test code also read very nicely and be a pleasure to work with, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Margaret, did you see any other questions? Any questions coming from the chat? I was just having a
no other questions from the chat, but just a personal note of my own. Just how awesome is this community to have Renee kind of be here to watch as well and to reach out with a package that you found useful. Because I guess, does that happen a lot, Felipe, where you're kind of like learning a little bit more about it and have the ability to kind of reach out and actually speak to the person who develops stuff like that? How often does that happen for you, I guess?
So like every time I reach out to people, they were super nice. So it feels great. I haven't done that a lot though, but every single time that I've done, people have been an amazing pleasure to work with. So yeah, this community is amazing.
Yeah, it just goes to show everyone. Don't be afraid to reach out. Everyone's great.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Felipe. Yeah, lots of great feedback in the chat there. A lot of people, I think, probably pumped to go away and play around with some of these chainable assertions, Fluent Assertions in Laravel. So thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge today, Felipe. Was there anything else you wanted to let the people know about chainable and assertions?
No, I just want to say thanks for having me. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Felipe. We'll talk to you soon. All right. Well, yes, once again, thank you to both Katerina and to Felipe for joining us this month once again. Shared two incredibly insightful talks, and there's definitely little nuggets of wisdom we can take away in our everyday work right away, and those always, for me, make some really excellent talks. So with that, Margaret, I think we just have a little bit of housekeeping to do to end things off this month. So I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. So we have another exciting meetup coming up next month. So you can join us Tuesday, July 30th at 12 p.m. to catch Steve McDougall's talk. He's going to be talking about what do we have? A deep dive into performant APIs using Laravel's built-in tools. So you don't want to miss that. So please join us next month. And apologies for what happened earlier. We have our QR code up and running now. So if you want to take a picture of this QR code, you will be welcomed to our giveaway. So fill in those details, and we were going to go and announce the winner on July 2nd. I think the next slide got some more details about
forget that QR code from the start of the stream. It's dead to us.
Yeah, this is the new one. So please use this one. And we'll announce the winners on July 2nd. Awesome. And just to make sure to keep up with us and all the Laravel Worldwide Meetup events, you can go to meetup.laravel.com to sign up for a monthly reminder to be able to catch us next time and have that arrive in your inbox. And if you want to follow us on YouTube, where you're kind of watching us now, you can find us on the Laravel official channel. You can also follow us on X at Laravel WW Meetup, and you'll find this video on the official Laravel YouTube channel. And that's what we got going on.
Awesome. And with that, I would like to once again thank our two speakers this month for coming and joining us and sharing their knowledge. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and sharing in that knowledge. And with that, Margaret, was there anything else we wanted to add before we head off and look forward to our July talk?
No, just enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll catch you next month.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. We'll see you, everybody, in July. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you soon. Bye.
See you.